Watch this.
We certainly won't have all the answers, and we may not even have a why about why this occurred or why these actions were taken.
And that may be the biggest downside of a Kohberger plea deal. But we do try to get some answers as to how attorneys could have ended up in this surprise scenario. Denying undocumented immigrants access to publicly funded benefits was a big priority for Idaho lawmakers this past session, but the state may have overstepped its bounds, according to a lawsuit and a judge, at least a little bit. Idaho's 2 senators just backed a massive spending bill, trillions in tax cuts, billions in defense, and no public land sell-off. Well, just 7 weeks away from what was supposed to be a months-long quadruple murder trial, and the man accused of committing those killings has decided a plea deal might be his best option. To avoid the possibility of a death sentence, yesterday we learned Brian Kohberger has apparently agreed to plead guilty to murdering University of Idaho students Kaylee Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, Xander Kernodle, and Madison Mogan at a rental home near the Moscow campus in November of 2022. And since the news of this deal came to light, a surprise to many, there have been several questions from you and from the victims' families about why the attorneys would agree to this, how it came about at this point in the process, and what this means going forward. Andrea Dearden spoke with Boise attorney Tara Malik, who has seen such situations from both sides as a special assistant U.S. attorney and now a defense attorney, to get some of those answers, including what both sides and the judge have likely been considering for a while.
So I'm sure that both sides really sat with the information that they had and assessed, what their trial strategies were going to be and what the risks were going to be if they proceeded forward. If there are victims involved, like they are in this case, what the victims' desires are and what their hopes are. And then finally, you're looking at what the reality of the situation is. What's your best case scenario if you go all the way through trial? Do you think that you're going to prevail? If you prevail, what happens after that? Is there a likelihood that there will be appeals? And most importantly, is there a plea arrangement that we can come to and a sentence we can come to where we really think that justice is being served and we're holding someone accountable for wrongdoing?
What we believe will be presented tomorrow at that hearing is guilty on all counts. So in that case, and it is the best case scenario, we're not dropping any charges, they aren't amending any charges, but full conviction on all 4 of these. Is that really the best case scenario for prosecutors?
If it's going to be a guilty plea to all 4 counts, to the 4 counts of murder, the 1 count of burglary, and we're talking about life sentences, no possibility of parole, consecutive life sentences, meaning stacked on top of each other, not happening at the same time, that's a good outcome because you are avoiding the uncertainties of trial. You're avoiding the costs of trial potentially.
You talked about the families being consulted or at least taking into consideration what they may want or their desires. Here we have multiple victims, perhaps families likely that feel differently, have different opinions. So how does that weigh on defense attorneys and prosecutors?
Well, they have to be consulted and kept in the loop. They have victims' rights, they have statutory rights there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the prosecutors don't represent a single family or a single victim, they represent the state. And so they have to do what is in the best interest of all in this scenario.
Judge Hippler is the presiding judge in this case. He will hear this agreement and does play a role, meaning that he has to accept it. But it's a limited role. So what will he be weighing and what does he really have to decide when it comes down to whether or not to accept this plea agreement?
What I anticipate happening tomorrow at tomorrow's hearing, if it is indeed a plea change hearing, is that the judge is going to engage in what's called a plea colloquy with the defendant. And what that means is he's going to make sure that if a plea is indeed being entered, that it's being done knowingly, voluntarily, that the defendant understands the charges against him, understands the plea agreement in its entirety before accepting that he's not being coerced or forced into making that plea, it's going to be even more imperative that the judge really gets to the heart of making sure that this defendant understands the rights that he is waiving.
That is probably the biggest piece of this plea agreement, or the one that caught my eye, is that he will waive, if what we understand to be true, that he would waive all rights to future appeals. How significant is that, and how unusual is it?
Well, it's very significant, especially in this type of case where we were looking at potentially a death penalty case. Death penalty cases, as most people are probably aware, there are lengthy appeals. You could be wrapped up in appeals for decades. There are rights, appeal rights that an accused has, and so it's a significant condition, if it indeed is part of this plea arrangement or agreement, that there's a waiver of those rights. That's a lot of time, it's a lot of cost, it's a lot of uncertainty that goes entirely away.
Now, that hearing for Kohberger to change his pleas to guilty is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. We would expect to hear all of the conditions laid out in the agreement, and then the next step will be sentencing, which will likely be scheduled weeks or even months from now. And it's during that sentencing that we will have the opportunity to hear all four victims' families have the opportunity to address Kohberger, to share how these crimes have affected them. We call those victim impact statements. So they will still have the ability to do that at that sentencing hearing.
And you kind of touched on this with Tara. I know that they're considered, their views and what they want to see happen is considered, but not the ultimate deciding factor. But we know that at least one family is beyond furious, the Gonzalez family, beyond furious with the state of Idaho. Do we know how the other families are feeling about this?
So most of them have been very quiet during this, and we know that that is to protect the case. We understand why that happens. We are understanding that some are relieved, saying that, people close to those families saying that they are relieved to avoid a trial and avoid having to hear all of that evidence and be there. And then, of course, we know that at least one family not happy about the decision.
Yeah, and the other thing that was kind of missing, you said the plea deal, or the appeal, excuse me, is a big part of this, not being able to do that. But another big part of this is the possibility we may never hear a motive for these killings. Is that correct? Sure.
Kohberger could, as the defendant, he also has the right to address the court during that sentencing hearing. But the likelihood that we're going to hear, him express something he did, that would be unheard of. So likely we will never know.
Yeah, it's going to leave a lot of people wondering why. Sure. And that's a big piece of this that we're expecting to hear at least part of it, or a reasoning for that in the trial.
Right. Well, as she said, trial doesn't always give us closure.
That's true. All right. Thank you very much, Andrea. Well, in anticipation of your questions about, the cost of prosecuting a death penalty case in Idaho, it's worth noting there isn't a specific answer to that. What we can tell you, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, capital cases can be anywhere from 3 to 5 times more expensive than non-capital cases. The trials are longer, with increased security, and of course, the usual appeals that follow, which on average take a full year longer than non-capital cases. That's according to a 2014 study from the Office of Performance Evaluations here in Idaho, which is a reason why a lot of them don't quite make it that far. In that same study from 2014, they admitted Idaho does not or did not collect enough data to fully account for cost. But they found very few first-degree murder cases in Idaho end in a death sentence, and even fewer end in executing that sentence. From 1998 to 2013, of the 251 people charged with first-degree murder, the death penalty was sought in just 55 of them. That's 22%. A couple others were withdrawn through the trial and the penalty phase, leaving 42 eligible for the death penalty over those years. Just 7 were sentenced to death, and only 2 others since that study was done. Well, since becoming a territory, Idaho has executed 29 men, but the state has completed just 3 executions since 1977. Currently, there are 9 people sentenced to death in Idaho, 8 men and 1 woman. And the most recent addition, Chad Daybell, back in 2024, just last year. And if you take him off the list, Idaho's capital criminals have spent an average of 28 years on death row. The longest at 42 years. That'd be Thomas Creech, who had a failed execution in February of last year and had another scheduled execution stopped in November. So who pays for trying these capital cases? Well, counties bear the brunt of the cost, but they do get some help from the Capital Crimes Defense Fund. Well, there was a slew of immigration-based laws passed this last session, and now another one has been partially blocked. A federal judge put this temporary and partial pause in place a day before it was set to take effect, which was today. House Bill 135 requires individuals to prove they're in the U.S. legally before receiving certain public benefits, including a federal program that provides free HIV medication to low-income patients. Brenda Rodriguez joins us now. And Brenda, this block only applies to one section of the law. The rest of it does go into effect today, correct?
Right, that's right. And the one that is blocked pertains to HIV, as you mentioned there. And ACLU says that the temporary restraining order protects undocumented people from a ban on access to life-saving HIV medication through the Ryan White program. An Idaho doctor and 4 undocumented patients sued the state, claiming that the new law will cut off life-saving HIV medications from immigrants who are entitled to them under federal programs. And they say that this would create an uptick in the spread of HIV in Idaho. But again, this is just one piece of that law. The rest will still go into effect. Right now, eliminating non-emergency health care and certain social services for undocumented immigrants. Bill sponsors say that that includes things like soup kitchens.
Crisis counseling and intervention, short-term shelter specified by federal law. We've struck that, but then we've added back in at short-term shelters, and there's definition below. For prenatal care, postnatal care, not to exceed 12 months, and for food assistance for dependent children.
The ACLU says that the language of this law is confusing and dangerous. While this is now in motion, they are hoping to stop the rest of the bill from staying a law.
It has potentially very wide ramifications for a variety of areas, and all of them are harmful, and none of them solve any problems that the state of Idaho has. And so it was really important to us to fight for the immigrant community because they're just as important as anybody else, and they deserve access to life-saving measures.
And the ACLU of Idaho says that this restraining order, again, just pertains to HIV medication, and this ban will be in place for 2 weeks to consider, or while the court rather considers the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction there.
Which, yeah, these TROs only last for like 2 weeks, and then they have to have that hearing to see if it's going to be extended. And well, the other thing the judge did was grant class action to this, so it doesn't just apply to the 5 plaintiffs that are named in this case. So it kind of broadens it a little bit, at least this injunction.
Everyone who, I guess, falls under this umbrella, yes.
It was interesting, during debate during that bill in the State House, several Republicans voted no because of how it would impact children in this case with soup kitchens and medical care. Yeah,
and we also heard the Idaho Food Bank testify in this as well, saying this is harming children, American children, as we've talked before. So yeah, this isn't something that they wanted as well. So organizations would have to turn away essentially people from these services. Yeah, all right, we'll see what happens on July 15th when they have that hearing. Thank you very much, Brenda. Well, it took another, it took another tie-breaking vote by the vice president. But the big domestic policy bill passed the Senate this morning and now heads back to the House. Trillions in tax cuts are included in it, but so are cuts to Medicaid spending, food assistance programs, and clean energy investments. What's not included? Any selling off of public lands. Utah Senator Mike Lee withdrew his provision over the weekend, blaming it on the, quote, constraints of the process, end quote, but mostly because nobody west of the Mississippi was on board with selling more than 1 million acres of public land. Joe Paris spoke with Idaho Senator Jim Risch about this yesterday, and according to the senator who voted for the bill today, there remains a disconnect between eastern and western lawmakers.
For instance, when we're talking about firefighting money, they really don't understand the fire problem out west. You have to talk to them a lot about it. They live differently than we do on the East Coast. I get it. Ours is different here in the West, particularly in Idaho, where 2 out of every 3 acres is owned by the federal government. Even more of that is public land. We love it. We use it. We cherish it greatly, and we're gonna fight to the mat to protect it.
Sure, but there's a bit of a downside to Idaho's 34.5 million acres of federally controlled land. It makes it kind of tough to fund Idaho's smaller schools, with roughly 12% of our public school funding budgets coming from property taxes. Senator Mike Crapo also voted for the bill, putting his motives on the mandate. With this bill's passage, he said, the United States Senate is fulfilling President Trump's promise to secure the border, fortify our national defense, and unleash American energy. It also prevents the biggest tax hike in U.S. history, he said. It delivers additional tax relief to hardworking families and takes significant steps to get our fiscal house in order. Neither Senator Risch nor Senator Crapo mentioned anything about cuts to Medicaid, SNAP benefits, the lifting of the debt ceiling, nor adding $3 trillion to our national debt over the next decade. Some folks might think Idaho potatoes hit peak fame in the 1950s, right about the time Marilyn Monroe slipped into a potato sack. Remember that? And when Idaho officially slipped into the first place in national potato production, right around that same time. Or maybe it was, like the late 1960s when J.R. Simplot shook hands with Ray Kroc to supply frozen French fries to the fast food chain McDonald's. But it actually goes back even further to 1928. And as Hunter Funk explains, the proof of that is not on the plate, but in the plate, I guess?
Yes, and I'm going to explain. It's the license plate.
Gotcha.
There it is. All right, before 1928, license plates across the United States just had the name of the state and the plate number. But Idaho paved the way for embracing what it is known for. This is what the first Idaho potatoes plate looked like. Green with a jumbo potato in the background.
Idaho was the first one to have a plate that recognized their main product, which is potatoes at the time. And we've had Idaho on the license plates for a long time, and its popularity has kind of ebbed and flowed. But lately it's been very popular with people in Idaho. They're very proud of their potato heritage and the story that goes with it.
Now, he did say the Idaho Potato Commission says the first plate had mixed reviews, and by the 1950s, they removed the potato that made it black and white over time. The black and white plate was eventually replaced by new plates like a green and white one, and the classic, the baked potato. Now you can even find the phrase famous potatoes right on the regular red, white, and blue license plates. Though this legislative session, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle could agree on one thing, passing House Bill 204, which brought back the one from the 1950s.
There seems to be an increasing demand to have this return to circulation and availability.
Now, it passed with a combined 99-1 vote this session, because if there's one thing Idaho doesn't mind being known for, it's a thing we've been growing and now promoting for nearly 100 years. Coming up at 6, if you buy the plate, where does the money go? We're going to break it down and explain how it might just lead to maybe the next famous potato.
J.R.'s Simplot's license plate was Mr. Spud.
Oh.
I wonder if that one's available in that classic form.
I mean, it could. He said that the numbers 1 through, I think, 50 are taken, and it ends in FP. So you could do Mr. Spud FP.
Yeah, I guess true. That might be sacrilegious, though, to try to take Simplot's plate and put it on your own car. Because, after all, there's only one Mr. Spud.
That's true.
That's true. All right,
Yeah.
We'll see that story at 6. Thanks, Hunter.
June officially in our rearview mirror, and July coming in hot, quite literally. These are our current temperatures, officially the hottest day of 2025 thus far. In Boise, we're up to 101. Mountain Home, a sweltering 104 degrees. No records set or tied here yet, but still this is unusually hot for the first day of July. We're at 96 in Jerome. Even Haley's at 93 degrees. McCall has just hit 90 as well. So scorching sunshine overhead for most areas. There was a little bit of active weather that developed earlier this evening. Most of it east of Twin Falls and north of Sun Valley is fizzling out. That's probably all she wrote as far as any storm activity. So hot sunshine remains the name of the game this evening. So if you don't have to be out and about in the heat of the day, I would avoid it if you can. Those walks with your four-legged family members or just yourself after dinner, I would put them off as long as you can. At 9 o'clock tonight, we'll still be in the mid-90s in Boise. It takes until closer to midnight to see those temps dipping into the 80s. Here's that big picture setup. High pressure still in control. An area of lower pressure off to the southwest. Between those, we're getting this hot air out of the south being funneled straight into southwest Idaho. There was a little dip in the jet stream off to the west. That will come in tomorrow and boost our storm chances for the afternoon. There's the potential tomorrow that some of those storms could turn severe, especially across eastern Oregon and far southwest Idaho. So something to watch for tomorrow. We keep rain and or storm chances in the mix through the 4th of July on Friday. But the good news is the Independence Day holiday will bring in some relief from the heat. The cooler air mass will cause a couple isolated rain showers, but won't be as blazing hot. Now tomorrow with some clouds in play early, we'll only hit or drop down to 70 in the morning in Boise. High temps tomorrow still up near 100 in the Treasure Valley, well into the 80s up in the mountains. After that, we start that slide back down to cooler conditions. Yes, a little bit stormy potentially on Friday. Then hot sunshine on deck for the rest of the weekend and into next week.
Final minute of the show. Let's get to your comments, like this one from Jack in Boise. It seems once elected, our congressional delegation forgets all about our debt issue. They just voted to increase it massively. Yes, they did over the next 10 years. Brian Kohberger gets a plea deal. No death sentence if he pleads guilty. Okay, so he took 4 young lives, and now as taxpayers have to support him for the rest of his life. How is that right? Well, as we explained, it actually is kind of more expensive to, I guess, convict somebody of a death penalty than it is to house them in prison for the rest of their lives. If Mr. Kohberger writes a book, it'd be good if any money from it was required to go to the victims' families, Bo and Burley. That could be part of the plea deal, by the way. We'll find out tomorrow, but he could be not allowed to do such a thing because you can't just then get those proceeds. But anything is on the table. We'll find out tomorrow what happens. If you're a death row, then it should be carried out right away instead of taxpayers paying for them to live in jail. What about those wrongfully convicted? What happens then? We'll see you tomorrow.
Continue with us and watch free now on the KTVB Plus app everywhere you stream.